Hello and welcome to Call to the Workforce, a podcast designed to support the professional and leader development of LDS and Christian women. I'm your host, Emily Chipman, and today we're going to be having Becca Pike talk about a really important topic that I hear executives talking about all the time, which is how to build your influence. And she's going to be talking about it from a really particular angle that I love because I have seen a lot of executives that I work with thinking through some of these very same things. So a little bit about Becca before we get started. Becca comes from an instructional design and curriculum development background. She previously worked at Deseret Digital Media, where she created an online training course for senior digital media. I've got my notes here, so we're going to make sure I get it right. Senior digital media operators who were wanting to transform their digital media businesses. She also worked at Wavetronics, where she facilitated courses like The 7 Habits, The Speed of Trust, The Outward Mindset, and Situational Leadership II. Her most current role is at Brigham Young University, where she's the Associate Director of Outreach and Recruitment, where she oversees a team that works on undergraduate outreach and recruitment. And if I remember correctly, you previously had some marketing in there as well. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So Becca is currently serving as a Stake Relief Society president. I asked her what her favorite calling was, and I think she said that you had been a Relief Society president 6 times, but that your favorite was serving as a camp director right after high school, which you're a saint probably for that.
I just love the outdoors. And
Yes.
honestly, to be honest, I love all of my callings.
I've known Becca for a couple of years now, and I was so excited to have her on because she is so fun. And I always think, when I think of Becca, I think she's this really involved aunt. She's an incredible friend. She's an incredible sister. And I truly believe that everyone who knows Becca comes away feeling appreciated and seen. And so I think this is going to be a really great podcast for today. So let's
Thanks,
jump
Emily.
in. Becca and I met to prep. I gave her this list of a lot of the topics that come up, and the topic that she picked was building influence. And I love this because one of the things that I think about as I worked with some of the executives are particularly the executives who are thinking about applying for or stepping into a new C-suite role. And one of the most important topics that comes up when they're thinking about this is their why and their purpose. And there's a lot of things to think about for them as they're thinking about whether or not to step into a new role. Like, is this consistent with where I want to go? Is it what my family wants? And I think this is a really important topic because if you're not in alignment with it and you're really inconsistent, it's very hard to build influence. We need to be thinking about our why and our purpose at the beginning of our careers, but all the way through until the end. And I know when we prepared, you talked a little bit about your path and how you've kind of figured these things out. And I would love for you to share with people some of the things that you've learned about knowing your why or that purpose and how it can translate into leading confidently.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like this became a necessity for me because there were some roles that I really loved, and then there were some roles that I wouldn't have chosen just naturally.
Yeah.
And that sounds funny because I was in a couple of different scenarios when a lot of these opportunities came. Yeah, the why and the purpose is probably the most important thing to me in anything that I do. And I've had some jobs that are really meaningful. I worked at the MTC when I was a student, and that was so easy for me to get behind. And I think it's one of the reasons that I would frequently think about my why, because as a missionary and someone who's teaching missionaries, you're frequently saying, what's your purpose? If it helps you fulfill your purpose, then it's worth your time, right?
Yeah.
And after I graduated, I went down a different path than what my undergraduate would have typically led you to. And so I ended up in some roles where I needed to find a deeper purpose than what was on the surface. And this especially became really apparent to me, or the importance of purpose became really apparent after I started a job that I hadn't really planned on. I had a completely different plan. I was moving out of state. I was going to get a job that was actually, it had been a dream job for me. And then all of the plans changed and I had to get a job quickly. And so I ended up starting at this company that I found myself sitting in my chair and thinking, why in the world am I here and how did I get here? and it was also a place where I didn't naturally connect with a lot of people that worked there. They thought I was weird because I like to go hiking. They're like, who does that? I was like, oh, well, I love it, you know? But I will say I also didn't really see a lot of value in the things that they love to do. And so I kind of found myself in this position where I just felt like, I don't even know what to do here. I can't stay here.
Yeah.
And
so how did you turn it around? How did you find the purpose and the why?
It actually turned around one day when I was at a meeting with all of the faculty, and one of them shared an experience where he was trying to provide for his family, and that's how he came to the job that he was at and how much his job meant to him. And all of a sudden, I saw him as an actual person. And that sounds funny because I was like, I mean, obviously we know people are people, right?
Yeah.
But I saw him. I saw into his heart, into what he was trying to do. And all of a sudden I was like, I can relate to you.
Yeah.
And I think that all of these people that I work with, I could relate to as well. And so the answer was I got outside myself and I started realizing that I didn't have to be working somewhere like the MTC or something that was really easy for me to draw a purpose out of, to see the purpose, because the people really mattered to me. And the product we were creating was going to impact people. And it was going to impact them in this way that this coworker was describing, that they could provide for their families, that it would give them opportunities. And so I started seeing them differently, and I totally changed the why behind what I was doing.
Yeah. You know what I love about this is that I think we do end up in, and I want to ask you some of the other principles that you've learned from that experience, but I'm just thinking about times that there are so many times that I meet someone and they've been in a role for a long time and they're not feeling particularly driven anymore. And I think it can be hard sometimes to feel like, you know, I'm not making progress. What is this purpose here? And what I really like that you're talking about is, I think, reconnecting with ourselves in a way. And I see executives do this when they are considering C-suite type roles or senior leadership roles, that as they're interviewing, even as they're interviewing and thinking about jobs, there's this time that they're starting to think like, is this really the path that I want to go down? So I think this concept of having to revisit this and relearn it happens over and over. So I'm curious for you, what are some of the other principles that you have learned and that you would add to from this story, really about allowing this to help you work and live in a really confident way in the role that you're in?
Do you know, when I left this company, I met with the HR director for lunch. We were talking about the contributions, the things to learn from and whatnot. And she was so kind and gracious in all of her feedback. And then at the very end, she said, Becca, I want to tell you something that you need to do more of. And I'd never seen myself in the light that she shared.
Yeah.
But she said, you're really strong and confident, but you're also soft. And she gave a specific individual as an example of somebody who could have used more of that influence in their lives because they had never experienced that before.
Yeah.
And she just said, Becca, do not be afraid to share who you are with people. They need it. And when I came into that position, it was it was a hard time in my life, and being able to turn outward was really helpful for me, but I could have done it even more. And I didn't realize what impact it was having just by being who I believed I needed to be. And I could have done more. And so I've thought about that frequently since I left. I was like, I don't want anyone to ever say that again.
Yeah. You know, something that came up as we were doing prep work that really intrigued me. You talked about don't be shy to reach out and share goodness boldly. And also this concept that you don't need to be a leader to have influence. As you're talking about this, it's reminding me that sometimes we have this idea of leadership means I fill out a performance review. And we forget that sometimes the leadership is 2 or 3 levels below where we are, or it's peers, or it's other people that we're working with. How have you learned to be bold, especially when, you know, I think that speaks to what you're talking about. Like, how have you learned to be bold in who you are and extending that regardless of role?
You're making me think of another this is making me think of another experience.
Uh-huh.
I was on another team and there was a lot of disparities between what people thought we should be doing, and people weren't coming to see eye to eye. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of influence because I wasn't the manager of this team.
Yeah.
And I was talking to my manager, and she said to me, she's like, Becca, leadership is not a position, it's the influence you have. And she actually taught me how to have conversations with people where you could help them feel heard, and you could impact what they were thinking and feeling. Not that you're telling them what to do, but it's helping them think outside of what they're used to. Right. And so it's the relationships that you're building with people. It's the way you listen to them. It's the way you share your thoughts.
Yeah.
And from that influence comes.
Yeah. So I'm just sitting here thinking about people who are listening to this conversation, and I know someone would sit here and say, Becca, what did she tell you about how to have that conversation? What did she teach you that you are still applying to this day?
You know, so I would say a lot of them are probably just good conversational skills, right? And she didn't actually go deep into those. And let me just remember, I had the thought and it just left, which is funny because it was really impactful. So just give me a second. She said, you're going to have to say things sometimes that are going to sound very hard for them to hear, but they need to hear it. So don't be afraid to share something that you know is true. Because for me, I want to be kind, right? But she taught me, she said, Becca, it is kind if it's something that's true, and you don't have to deliver it in an unkind way. But if it's something that's going to help them and they can feel that from you, they will respond.
Yeah.
And so that was something that really stuck with me.
So we had kind of talked about some of the different things that we wanted to cover in the podcast, and I know I'm kind of taking this a little bit out of left field, but I want to jump to one of the topics that you brought up, which is about building influence by being kind, being honest, being hopeful. And I'm curious for you, because we do work in a world that is sometimes very harsh. How are you able to bring in being kind and honest and hopeful, and at the same time maintain the professional expectations that we need to?
It's a great question. I feel like this varies by individual, but some of the generalized principles, I'd like to come back to the purpose. It's not about a power struggle between what I think and what you think. It's what are we trying to accomplish together?
Yeah.
And if you can come to that, the conversation becomes a lot easier because it's no longer personal.
Yeah.
This is our greater purpose. How are both of us contributing to this?
Yeah.
And then another thing I think that is very helpful is asking them questions. I don't know everything. I think it's having humility, coming into this saying, I don't know everything. I think I can learn something from this individual when we're talking. I'm going to ask them their questions. And also, I think a lot of individuals already know what they need to do, but there's something that's stopping them.
Yeah.
So sometimes asking them those questions helps them to come to themselves, to put it maybe in a cliche, that's a cliche phrase, but it helps them come to themselves and they think, oh, you know what? This is why I'm here and this is who I want to be.
Yeah.
And let's have this conversation and figure out how to move forward.
Yeah. And I think that what this brings to mind is this concept of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't talk a lot about leaders being curious, but I think it's a really big thing. We had talked, or we had done a little bit of prep work in terms of thinking about, it'd be good to talk about influence and how do we give feedback to influence development or growth for people. And I love this concept of inserting curiosity into the feedback conversation, just because we sometimes see something and we're like, well, oh, that has to be why they're doing something. And that's the kind of feedback I need to give them. But if we take the time to be curious, to talk with them about what we've seen, we sometimes learn something that we didn't know. What are some of the other things that you have learned about giving feedback, especially because it can be hard?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do it from a place of kindness and curiosity and love?
Well, and again, I think I was going to say I ask them questions. Still, questions are a big part of it, honestly, because I'll ask them. I like to tell people what they're going to be judged on or how
Mm-hmm.
we're measuring success and bringing it back to that conversation and say,
Yeah.
okay, how would you say that we're doing here?
Yeah.
Right. And I also think people need to hear things that they're doing well.
Yeah.
I know people will talk about like sandwiching conversations with positive
Yeah.
things and whatnot. I don't do it that formally, but what I try to do is I even pray about this and I pray to Heavenly Father, say, will you please help me to understand this holistically? Will you help me
Yeah.
to see all of the good, and will you help me to see how I will help me to understand this person, help them to understand as well, and that we can see eye to eye. And
Yeah.
so I pray for that.
Yeah.
And I have come out of those types of conversations sometimes being completely blown away by what I learned because I had no idea what they were facing. Because
Yeah.
often what I found is it's in their personal life or it's
Yeah.
something that they've come with because of previous experience. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like they need to be able to talk about it to be able to overcome whatever is holding them back.
Yeah.
And
You
then
know,
there's lots of things we could speak to, but
yeah. But it's true if we take the time to find out. And when I was trained as a manager, one of the things that they talked about is um, the person who was training me called it the 80-20 rule, meaning if they're doing 80% of their job well, you need to be giving them 80% positive feedback, right? And
mm-hmm.
actually, for the most part, I feel like people are really doing well, but we do have these times that we see dips, and sometimes it's from miscommunication, or like you said, it's from personal life. There's a lot of well-being support from companies now that you actually can entirely shift from saying this is a performance conversation to now it's a well-being conversation. And when employees or people have the chance to realize that they're going to be supported in their well-being, I think they become very committed to those to the leaders, to the companies, and it can make a huge difference.
Well, and I think people want to contribute, right? They want to know that they're making a difference. Can I say one
Mhm.
other thing that we haven't
Yeah.
mentioned in this that I think is
Yeah.
really important? This has been a really important lesson for me to learn, that I have to let other people own their agency.
Yeah.
Because or like their choices, their agency, however you want to word that, because sometimes I want to own it because I don't want them to hurt. I don't want
Mm.
them I don't want them to lose their job. I don't want them to have negative impacts, right? But I think that's where the really clear communication is kind.
Yeah.
Because you can say, let's talk about your job. Let's talk about your expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about how you're performing. You can inform me about anything that you feel is in the way. And then I also ask them, please tell me what I'm doing that's maybe making your job more difficult. Right? So
Yeah.
having these conversations and then being able to lay out the plan. This is what success looks like.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes it does get to the point where it says, if these things are not met, you may be at a place where you could lose your job.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
you have to have those conversations, because if you don't, they're going to feel blindsided, and they're
Yeah.
going to think, why did nobody tell me what I needed to do?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
But you have to give it to them, and if you do that, you let them own the results.
Yeah. It's always better to have the conversation. In fact, it's less painful. Like sometimes when I work with leaders, one of the things that is really clear to me is we don't want to hurt. We don't want the discomfort. We don't want the people to have the discomfort, but also usually by the time those things happen, there's some sort of frustration, probably on both ends, of resources or support that's needed. So it's better to just have the conversation. And this makes me think a lot. I love what you said, that you have to let people be responsible for themselves, because when we think about influence, part of the influence concept is that we're able to move people to do things, but we actually don't have control over things. And I'm thinking about how we don't get to choose our coworkers. We don't always get to choose our assignments. I think about even executives I've worked with who went through a merger or who've been through layoffs, and they didn't choose those. They didn't choose these experiences. And even COVID. You think about how COVID just threw
It's crazy.
Everything up in the air, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just like someone let out a bag of cats. That someone on the podcast loves cats. I'm not bad mouthing them. I just have this picture in my mind of cats everywhere, and that is COVID to me. Of everything was going on. So, given that we try to build influence and we don't always have control, how do you focus, and where do you focus?
I think this is a Covey principle, right? It's the circle of influence versus the circle of concern. And when you focus on your circle of concern, your circle of influence shrinks. But when you focus on your circle of influence, then your influence grows.
Can you explain that for people who are not as familiar with Covey concepts?
Sure, yeah. So the circle of concern, there are things you care about. There are things that may even impact you, but you cannot, maybe there's a policy that's in place that you cannot directly change. And so that's in a circle of concern. Your influence is, these are the things that I have direct control over. And so I can control how responsible I am in my job. I can show up. I can perform to my best ability. I can build relationships. All of these things that you can actually control.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you do those things, you tend to get more influence because people see that you're being effective in what you have control over.
Yeah. What has been the impact for you professionally as you have done this and as you follow these principles?
That's it. I mean, so I don't know how much to share about the background, but every job that I've been in, I think that sometimes I've never really felt like, oh, this is my end all be all. Yeah. Right? I didn't feel like I have arrived. This is my dream job and the place I want to be. But I can genuinely say I loved all of them. And so I think it's one of the things it's done is I don't feel like I've been enduring through my career until I come to a place where I'm really happy. I feel like I've genuinely loved all of them. But what it's done is it's opened new doors for me. And it's been so fascinating to see how a previous experience that I didn't think that I cared too much about, but I invested, and so I gained new skill sets, and it opened doors for me to do other things that I really did love and enjoy, and they've come together in the most unique, beautiful way.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have happened if I didn't invest.
At some point this season, we're going to have someone on who's going to talk about Jessica Johnson, who talks about a mosaic of experiences, how all of these different things come together. And I was thinking the other day about my experience professionally, that, if you lay it out of what I thought I was going to do and where I'm at today, you would think not only that it's, I don't know, you might look at it and be like, were you just like a little grasshopper moving from place to place with zero direction? But I do feel like there was always something from the prior job that led me to the next job, that led me to the next job, that led me to the next job. And they were very, very different, but they truly have all come together. And I had an experience a few years ago where all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, this professional experience I had a long time ago just really pulled everything together. And I used experiences and skills from every single job to produce something that actually had big impact.
Mm-hmm. And often it's the impact that you really deeply care about.
Yeah. And this was surprising to me because I think what's hard about this concept, and I love this concept, is we don't always see the path of how it pulls together. And candidly, I could not have pieced that together. I just couldn't have. I couldn't have pieced that together in my life, but I'm really grateful for it. So I would love to kind of dig in a little bit more personally with you on some of this path. So you've had a path that's also been different. And we've talked about the importance of finding your why and finding your purpose. What for you do you think is your big purpose? What's the driving why for you?
It'll sound really cliche, Emily, but I feel it very deeply. I want to be a disciple of Christ. And that is my overall purpose. And I want to leave people better than I found them. And I want whatever I do to create opportunities for people. So, yeah.
I love that you shared all of these three things because I can see all of these being things that you can apply and in any job, right? Like we can always leave someone better in any way. And like we were talking about earlier, actually, I don't remember if I mentioned this, but it was something I was thinking about that, our big whys can lead to and influence what we do day to day. And so this concept of if you do want to leave people better, do we slow down? Even though it's really crazy and there's huge demand, how do we, I think the question I have for you is how do you check in with those big purposes and those really important things when maybe there's a deadline that's due in 2 hours and things really are not going well?
I'll tell you this, I'm not perfect at it.
I'm not perfect. For saying that, because thank you for humanizing. I just stayed with my nieces and nephews for a week and a half. And let me tell you what, I was not perfect. I love those kids, but I was not perfect. And I think we have so many expectations of perfection. So thank you for humanizing for all of us that we don't have to be perfect. And, and how do you check in those moments or repair or remind yourself?
Honestly, sometimes I have to be very intentional about it. So if it's going really well, there are certain times where I will just have checks with myself, like reminders. And a lot of times it's in even my personal study or things like, where's my focus? Where's my focus? How am I doing? And sometimes it's when there's an issue that's happening. I'm like, I have lost my focus. That's part of the reason this is happening. Or if I don't feel motivated for some reason, it helps me to go back to that and dig deep.
Yeah.
But I also try to just make it part of who I am. That's why I say I do it in my personal study, so that it's almost like I don't have to think about it because it's just part of who I am.
Yeah.
And so I've had to remind myself over and over and over. And if I get off track, I try to come back on track.
Yeah.
And that probably feels very vague, but it even comes in like certain times where I don't want to learn a new tool, or maybe there's something that's not my favorite thing to do. But the thing, if those purposes that I've shared, they actually require that I do those things so that I can be effective at what matters the most to me. And so I have to remind myself in some of those moments, because I don't think there's any job that doesn't have something at some point that you're like, I don't really want to do that.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't sound fun to me.
Yeah.
And so it's a good reminder.
Yeah. When I do, when I work with leaders and we choose goals, this is one of the things that can often flip the switch for them in terms of thinking about, do I want to do this hard thing? And it really is it consistent with who I want to become and the outcome that I'm looking for? In terms of you and who you want to become, you've talked about your faith. And I want to pivot for the last part of this slightly and ask you, you do a lot of volunteer work with our church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you hold a volunteer role that is a leader of leaders. So you're a leader at work, but you're also a leader in your volunteer work. And for my friends who are listening who aren't members of my faith, you probably have roles like this in the community as well, where maybe you are the head softball coach or, things along those lines. How do you see these things fitting in a volunteer or church setting? How are you able to build influence in those types of scenarios?
I think it's the same way.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
And a lot of inviting. I think a lot of leadership is helping people to remember their vision and their purpose. And when you are leading leaders or other people in general, I think it's really important to trust them. So to know, if I teach you this principle, you are going to figure out how to apply it.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about how, I would love to, but I want you to be able to do that yourself. So back to that enabling people.
Yeah.
I want them to know and understand the principle. I want them to feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they're not going to do that unless they experience it and try it.
Yeah.
So sometimes you also have to let them, maybe something that they carry out is not as perfect as you wish it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I look at it and I think, did that leader grow?
Mm-hmm.
Did they learn something from this that they're going to apply next time and it's going to be better?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You have been on a very different journey and than what I think you imagined for yourself when you were 18, 19, 20.
Yeah.
How has your faith played a role as you've walked this path? You mentioned earlier that one of your whys is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. How has it influenced? And what's happened in your life as you've had that experience?
It's influenced everything, Emily.
Yeah.
It actually might make me emotional because I have a lot of gratitude, because I think the way I could summarize it is I've done my best to let him lead me along. And sometimes I've received answers that I did not anticipate. Can I share a story here?
Yeah, of course.
So
we're here for it.
Great.
We're all here for it.
I think this might illustrate it a little bit better. And this will just be one of many of these types of experiences. But I had been, I mentioned that I wasn't following the path that I thought it would after my undergraduate education. I wanted to leave the state of Utah. I wanted to go work somewhere else, and I could not feel great about it. And I was just like, why? And my dad worked at the university I went to, it's BYU, and I wanted to leave to go have other experiences. And then I had an opportunity to come back up where I would stay on campus. And I just thought to myself, I do not want to do this. I love BYU, but I have a very different plan, right? So I accepted it, and I applied those principles of do what you can, right? And appreciate it and enjoy it, contribute. So I worked there for a little while, and I worked in registrars, and then I went to admissions. And I mean, all of these have a lot of stories and guidance. I'd applied to a philanthropy's job previously, and I really wanted that job. It didn't come to fruition. They actually came back at the same time that I was being offered another job in admissions, and I didn't feel great about it anymore. And it's like, that's what I've always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then when I was in admissions, I had taken the GRE and I had thought about going to grad school in instructional psychology and technology, which, I mean, spoiler alert, that's what I ended up doing, right? But I had a bunch of different options on the plate. And the reason I did it is so that I could work while I was doing my grad program. It made so much financial sense to me. But I was praying about it one day, what to do about the grad program. And this is the answer I got: Becca, quit your job. And I was just like, and I actually think I verbally said, no. Like, I don't want to do that. And I went to work and it kept coming back to my mind. And so I actually went into my car to read during lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like the quiet place I could be. And so I opened my scriptures and I read in John where Christ asks his apostles, do you love me more than these? The fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I read it, I felt very clearly this phrase come into my mind: do you love me more than the security of your job?
Mm.
And I heard it and it went to my very center, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I was like, if I ignore this, I will not feel okay about anything I'm doing. And so I quit my job, and I actually didn't even know if I was going to do my grad program. There's a lot of story there too, but I ended up doing it and it completely changed my life. And what's funny about accepting that job at BYU, I mean, I had 7 years of a lot of different experiences that I loved, but all of those prepared me for the job I currently have, because one of the offices I worked in approached me again and said, Becca, would you come back and contribute in these ways that were really meaningful to me? They were things I actually really wanted to do.
Yeah.
So none of it, like, that's a very high level explanation of a lot of guidance that I feel like I've been given, and I feel so grateful, because I wouldn't have written it the way that it is.
Yeah. If you were to sum it up in principles and say the most important principle is, what would you say in terms of the experience that you've just shared?
That specific experience?
Yeah.
Trust God, let him lead you, and trust that he's going to make more out of it than you could yourself.
You know, when I was in graduate school, or my graduate program, the last assignment was to create a 5 or 10-year career plan. And I remember sitting there trying to write it and thinking, I have no idea how to write this. And I think most women who are listening to this will resonate with this because of what happened. I can say that because I know what happened in my class. We sat down to talk about the, our career plans and visions. And it was so interesting that woman after woman raised her hand and said, I do not know how to plan for this because I don't know what role children will have or marriage will have. And I remember, Clayton Christensen wrote a book on living a meaningful and purposeful life. And he talked about how, really when you look at professions and careers or even businesses, we don't know what's going to happen with the market. Like, nobody could have called COVID and the businesses that shut down or the businesses that just had explosive growth because of it. We just can't call it. We can't sit down and say, this is absolutely what's going to happen. But what you have talked about here, and I know, and I have seen this in my own life too, for people who aren't members of our faith, it's kind of like these gut instincts where you're like, I need to slow down. And you slow down just in time to avoid a car accident. And I know when we listen to those gut instincts that it changes things for the better. And we don't always see it play out until years later. And I think sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we just don't see it at all, but we know as we learn to listen to that gut instinct. And I have heard executives talk about this, about the importance of knowing when to trust that gut instinct. But truly, and in our phrase and in our faith, we talk about this being inspiration or kind of like pings from the universe, however you want to put it, those nudges, that as we listen, we are led on a better path. Becca, I have loved having you on here in terms of talking about influence and building it with, I think you're so right. We can't have influence when we're not living authentically. And I think you've done I just thank you for sharing your story, because you have lived authentically and it has taken you in a very different path than you expected. But I see just even what you've shared with us has been a wonderful gift, and I appreciate it. To wrap up, and I always like to end this way, if you could give another woman a word of encouragement, what would you say to her?
I'd say that there's power in goodness. There's power in doing good, and that you trust that you are good.
I don't think we hear that enough. I think as women, we don't acknowledge our goodness enough. There is so much goodness we have.
So much.
So give us that line one more time.
Just there's power in goodness.
And don't underestimate it.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you to everybody who has been listening. Becca, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
I know I personally have just soaked this in like a sponge. So we will be back with the podcast. So listeners, you can expect to hear these episodes about once a week. And just a quick reminder, if you have found this helpful, we are going to be putting up all of these up on the major platforms like YouTube, Apple. So please subscribe. And most of all, if you have found this helpful, please share this with other women. Take care, everyone, and we will see you next time.